gone. You should find your way home. I know you can accomplish this because you are not afraid. At home, you ought to open the briefcase. You will find that it also has a combination lock, but this is simply the address of the house. If you didn't think to look, you may need to return to the house the following night. I know you would do that because you're not afraid. Once you've found the address and you open the briefcase, you will find what I have sent you to look for, and the reason for all of your trouble. It's the deed to the house. The city cannot demolish the house without this document. Be careful with it, as it is over 100 years old. Bring it to the city and have them demolish the house. Bring it to the city and have them demolish the house. Once and for all, my family will be able to rest. And maybe this will be adequate repentance for what I did to them all those years ago. If you do get the city to demolish that house, my family's bodies will be interred in the rubble. Finally at peace. If not, you left the front door unlocked, didn't you? God forbid someone else enter that house by chance, but that doesn't have anything to do with you. And anyway, they have nothing to fear, right? This is not my story. It is my daughter's story. Her name was Teresa. She died 2 weeks ago, a suicide by overdose. She called me just prior to the act, informing me of her intentions and the reasons behind them. I of course pled with her, begging her through tears not to go through with what she had planned, but she was resolute in her decision, and with growing horror, I realized this was no bluff. No desperate cry for attention or reassurance. As she hung up the phone, I knew with certainty she was already as good as dead. I knew it from the moment she had said,
"Daddy, Ray is here."
I immediately phoned the police, knowing that they would be able to reach her well before I could, but I also knew they would be too late. They found her in bed, by all appearances in a deep and peaceful sleep. One hand draped across her stomach, the other outstretched to the side, palm up, fingers curled as if clutching something. Another hand, perhaps. But the other side of the bed, Ray's side, was empty. This is also Ray's story. He died a little more than a year before Teresa did. He was shot twice, once through his right hand, which he had held out defensively, the bullet piercing both his cell phone and his palm before lodging in the tile of the wall of the bathroom in which he had made a final desperate attempt to hide. The second bullet found his neck, and he bled out quickly, alone on the cold floor. He was one of 9 people who died in his office building that day. 8 of those people thought it was just another Monday at work, unaware that they would not be walking out alive at the end of the day. The 9th to die, the shooter, had no intention of walking out again. Ray had called Teresa on his lunch break that day. She was at home, and the sight of his name lighting up her cell and causing it to buzz had made her smile. Married only 3 months, the pair was still in that young, fleeting honeymoon stage of marriage, and Ray would frequently find any excuse to phone his bride from work if time allowed.
"Hello?"
She answered, a smile on her face.
Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?
"I don't know. Why did he?"
Teresa responded.
Because he was stuck in a vicious cycle.
Teresa chuckled. The joke wasn't really all that funny, but Ray had always delighted in corny humor, and his joy in telling these awful jokes brought Teresa more pleasure than the punchline itself. Case in point, he had used a ridiculous pickup line to win her over in the first place. "Feel my shirt," he had said to her, a stranger in a sea of people crammed into a mixer at one of her girlfriend's apartments 2 years ago. "Do you know what it's made out of? Boyfriend material." Teresa had laughed out loud. One, because the punchline was genuinely funny, and two, because Ray, tall and attractive in a goofy kind of way, was so ridiculously happy to use it on her. His smile contagious and immediately endearing. And as bad as the line had been, it had worked. They had been together ever since.
How was your day?
Teresa said, sitting down at the kitchen table.
Living the dream.
Ray responded with some sarcasm.
Actually, my presentation went well this morning. I'm supposed to present it again to senior staff on Wednesday. Things are looking promising.
That's great news.
It really is.
Ray said, satisfaction in his voice.
You know, if this proposal goes through, we should celebrate. Go away somewhere.
There was a pause on Ray's end.
That sounds like a wonderful idea.
He responded, only now he sounded slightly distracted.
Do you have some place in mind?
I don't know.
Teresa said, thinking.
Cheryl has that cabin that she said we're always welcome to use. We ought to take her up on that sometime. She and Brad will end up selling it before we ever use it. It would be nice to get away.
Ray didn't respond.
Babe?
A moment's hesitation.
Did you hear that?
Hear what?
Teresa said, but before he could respond, she heard it. A loud report, a distant bang coming over the phone.
Ray, what was that?
I don't know.
He said, and from the sound of his voice, he was walking. His voice sounded shaky. There was a second loud report, still distant but closer, and Teresa felt her hands go cold when she thought she heard a woman scream.
I'm gonna find out what's going on. I'll call you back.
Ray?
Teresa said, but he was gone. She set the cell phone down on the table and stared at its black screen. She got up suddenly from the kitchen table, walked to the sink, and filled a glass with water, which she downed. Staring over at the phone, she willed it to ring again, to show Ray's name. It did not. Teresa rushed over and picked it up. She called Ray's cell phone. It went to voicemail. She called his desk phone. It too went to voicemail. She called reception at his office. No answer. She slammed the phone back down on the table, hands trembling. She found it hard to catch her breath, to not imagine the worst, to convince herself that what she had heard did not mean what she thought it meant. An interminable moment later, her phone rang. She snatched it up.
Ray!
Baby?
He said, whispering, his tone urgent.
There's a man with a gun.
Teresa sank into the chair.
Where are you?
I'm in the bathroom down the hall from my office. Reese, he killed Mark. I saw it happen.
His voice was trembling, on the verge of tears or panic.
Ray, hang up and call the police.
I did.
He insisted.
They're on their way.
Okay, just be calm.
She said this as much to herself as she said it to Ray.
Where is he?
I don't know. I saw him at the end of the hallway. I saw him shoot Mark. I came in here because it was the closest door. I don't know if he saw me.
Did you lock the door?
The door doesn't lock.
He said, a small sob hitching in his voice.
I'm in one of the stalls. It's locked.
Teresa began to cry silently, the hopelessness of Ray's situation sinking in.
Who is he?
I don't know. He's wearing a mask, a ski mask. I think he's...
Ray stopped talking suddenly at the sound of a loud bang, disturbingly close. Ray hesitated and took a long, shaking breath.
I love you, Reese.
He whispered, his voice even quieter now, barely audible.
No.
There was another loud banging sound, but this time it wasn't the report from a gun. It was the sound of a door being kicked open and hitting a wall. Ray took a sudden, gasping breath.
Ray?
Teresa whispered, the sound of the door of the bathroom stall being kicked.
No!
Ray cried out, and the sound of his desperation made Teresa's entire body go numb.
Ray?
Teresa said, louder. The sound of the stall door crashing open.
No!
Ray screamed.
Ray!
Teresa yelled. The sound of a gun. And then, everything was silent in the house for several seconds as Teresa struggled to take in a breath. Finally, she screamed. The shooter was a man named Vincent Holland. He had worked in the engineering department just one floor down from Ray's office in marketing, a textbook disgruntled employee with manic depressive issues. At least that was the story that the press was reporting. Vincent had managed to kill 8 of his co-workers, and then he turned the gun on himself at the first sound of approaching sirens. The following 24 hours were a blur for Teresa. Through a haze of shock, she had answered police questions, had identified her husband's body, his face pale but still unmistakably his own, and had made necessary phone calls to friends and family. And in the moments between, Teresa had wept, her body crushed under the weight of a grief that was nearly unbearable, the physical pain of it enough to make her welcome the thought that perhaps it might kill her.
What a mercy that would be,
she thought. The night of Ray's death, she had slept the deep and artificial sleep of the drugged, her body succumbing to whatever cocktail her best friend Cheryl had insisted on giving her. Teresa had not asked, and did not even care what the pills were, but had taken them all and quickly slipped into the warm embrace of sleep, where her grief at least briefly could not reach her. When she woke the next day, she wondered briefly why her chest hurt so badly. It took but a moment for her to remember, and the tears were immediate. She rolled over and put her palm on Ray's side of the bed, where the mattress was cold and empty. Behind the sound of her crying, she could hear voices down the hallway. Cheryl and Teresa's mother were speaking in somber tones. Teresa looked at the clock. It was shortly after noon. Cheryl's sleeping pills had caused her to sleep for more than 11 hours. Teresa sat up in bed and wiped the tears from her cheeks, consciously pressing the sorrow deep down into her stomach. She picked up her cell phone from the nightstand, more out of habit than necessity, and she shuffled toward the bathroom, flipping a switch. The light assaulted her eyes, and for a moment she absorbed her own pitiful reflection. Eyes swollen, cheeks splotchy, nose red. She took in a long, shaking breath. Then her phone buzzed in her hand and she jumped. The screen said, "Ray." Teresa stared at it, a mixture of disbelief and confusion coursing through her brain. She answered it.
Hello?
Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?
Ray said. Teresa struggled to take a breath, and when she was finally able, it came in a rattling gasp. She took an involuntary step away from the mirror, as if retreating from what she was hearing. Her mind raced as she felt a sudden surge of hope warring against her lingering sorrow, and she wondered if perhaps the events of yesterday had been nothing but an incredible dream.
Because he was stuck in a vicious cycle.
Ray concluded.
Ray?
Teresa said.
Yeah, baby?
He responded.
What's wrong? The joke wasn't that bad.
Where are you?
I'm at work.
He said with a slight chuckle.
I just got out of a meeting. My presentation went well. I'm supposed to present it again to senior staff on Wednesday. Things are looking promising.
Teresa didn't respond.
Reese, are you okay?
He asked. Teresa looked at herself in the mirror, at her Halloween mask of grief. The floor felt like it was tilting under her, and her brain, still kicking off the last remnants of Cheryl's pills, was a swamp of conflicting thoughts.
Reese?
He said again.
What day is this?
What? It's Monday. What's going on? What's wrong?
It's Tuesday.
No, it's...
Ray began, but then he stopped. There was a silence on both ends of the phone for a moment. Then Ray said,
Did you hear that?
Hear what?
She asked. Then she heard it, and a sick feeling of déjà vu swept through her. There was a loud report, a distant bang coming over the phone.
What was that?
Ray said, and from the sound of his voice, he was walking.
Ray, wait!
Teresa said. There was another loud report, still distant but closer, and Teresa heard a woman scream.
I'm going to find out what's going on.
Ray said.
I'll call you back.
Don't!
Teresa said, but he was gone. Teresa put her phone down on the bathroom sink and stared down at it, her hair cascading in front of her eyes. She shook her head violently, trying to shake off the confusion that made it difficult for her to focus. She ran her fingers through her hair and then pulled at it in frustration. She picked her phone back up and called Ray's cell. Voicemail. She called his desk phone. Voicemail. She called the reception at his office. The outgoing message informed her that in light of yesterday's tragic events, the office would be closed for the remainder of the week. Teresa furrowed her brow and put the phone down on the sink again. Seconds later, it rang again. The screen said Ray. She answered it without saying anything.
Reese?
Ray said, his voice whispering panic.
Listen to me. There's a man with a gun.
Teresa began to sob, and her hand shook so violently that she could barely hold the phone to her ear.
I'm in the bathroom down the hall from my office. The baby, he killed Mark. I saw it happen.
Ray's voice trembled, on the verge of tears. Teresa said nothing.
I called the police. They're on their way.
He took a long, trembling breath. Teresa sat down on the floor and brought her knees up to her chest. She began to rock back and forth.
I don't know where he is now. I saw him at the end of the hallway. I saw him shoot Mark. I came in here because it was the closest door. I don't know if he saw me, but the door doesn't lock. I'm in one of the stalls.
There was a long moment of silence.
Reese, talk to me.
Ray demanded desperately.
Ray.
She said through her sobs. She could manage no more words than that.
I don't know who this guy is.
Ray said.
He's wearing a mask, a ski mask. I think he's...
But Ray stopped talking suddenly at the sound of a loud bang, disturbingly close. He hesitated and took a long, shaking breath.
I love you, Reese.
He whispered. Over the phone, Teresa heard the sound of a door being kicked open and hitting a wall. Ray gasped. Teresa relived the sound of the bathroom stall door being kicked open,
No!
the sound of Ray's desperate objection, and the final sound of the gun being fired. And then, in the ensuing silence, Teresa relived the grief of her husband's death for the second time. She told no one about the call, not Cheryl and not her mother. She couldn't explain it to herself, much less anyone else. The two had continued to keep her company throughout the day, answering phone calls, dealing with concerned well-wishers, attempting to get Teresa to eat, and managing the details of Ray's viewing and funeral, which were scheduled for Saturday evening and Sunday morning, respectively. But mostly, the two of them were there simply to make sure that Teresa was not alone. In her waking moments, they treated her like an antique porcelain doll, delicate and fragile. Teresa slept for most of the day, even without Cheryl's chemical help. She ate hardly at all, a fact that distressed her mother. She had still been in bed at noon on the following day, Wednesday, 2 days after Ray's death, when her cell phone rang. The screen said, Ray. Her body went numb, and she quietly began to cry. She answered it.
Ray?
Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?
He said. Teresa ended the call immediately and then shut her phone off completely and tossed it aside. She lay in bed and wept. On the third day, Thursday, Teresa was alone in the house. Cheryl and her mother had other things to attend to and hadn't been outside the house since Monday evening. Teresa had showered, brushed her hair, and even put on a bit of makeup. Her arms felt weak and heavy as she did so, but she attempted a tired smile as she insisted that she would be fine if her mother and best friend left her alone for a little while. When her cell phone rang shortly after noon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, the bright sunlight through the windows making her headache after so much time spent in the darkness of her bedroom. She answered it, her voice weak.
Because he was stuck in a vicious cycle.
There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Teresa wondered if Ray was really there. Finally, he laughed and asked,
How did you do that?
I'm not sure.
Are you okay? You sound strange.
Teresa took a deep breath.
Do you know who Vincent Holland is?
Yeah, he works down in engineering, I think. I don't know him real well. I do know that every day at lunch he eats an onion like an apple. Never really seen anything like it.
Ray, he has a gun.
Teresa said.
What? How do you know that?
Don't ask me that right now. He has a gun and he's going to start shooting people. You have to get out.
Reese, I don't...
But then Ray stopped as they both heard the sound of a gun being fired.
What was that?
Listen to me. You have to get out of the building.
Ray was silent for a moment. Then he said,
Okay, I'm going.
And then the phone fell silent. Teresa put the phone on the table and stared at it. Dust floated silently through a sunbeam that cascaded through the window and landed in the warmth on the back of her hand. She wondered how the sun continued to shine as if the entire world wasn't enveloped in grief like she was. Her phone rang again. Ray. She answered.
Baby,
I saw him.
Ray whispered.
where are you?
I'm in the bathroom down the hall from my office. Baby, he killed Mark.
Teresa ended the call and slammed her phone back down on the table. She put her hands over her eyes and cried. Friday, shortly after noon, Teresa sat at the kitchen table with Cheryl and her mother. The three of them were quietly nursing cups of tea, the kitchen counters and nearly every other available surface covered in gift baskets and flowers. Teresa's mother and Cheryl made quiet small talk as Teresa sat silently, her eyes intently focused on her cell phone, which sat like a dumb blank slate on the table in front of her. 12:03 came and went without a call. Teresa chuckled mirthlessly to herself. She had intentionally made sure she was not alone for today's phone call from Ray. If he did call again, this time she wanted witnesses, but part of her knew that he would not call her if she was not alone.
Is everything okay, Reese?
Cheryl asked. Teresa peeled her eyes away from the silent phone.
Yes.
She whispered and sipped her tea. I flew in from across country for Ray's viewing and funeral. Teresa's mother and I were cordial towards each other, but also avoided each other as much as possible for Teresa's sake. I was shocked at how she looked, tired and haggard and grief-stricken, of course, but also troubled in a way that did not look like simple mourning. I held her tightly several times over the course of those 2 days, always at a loss for words, wishing there was anything in the world I could do to remove the weight of sorrow pressing on her shoulders. Teresa told me later that she had tucked her phone away during those 2 days of activities. She had thought that maybe going through the ceremony of remembering Ray's life, seeing his serene face as he lay dead in his casket, and then watching with surprising detachment as his body was lowered into the ground would bring a final end to his daily calls. But on Monday, alone at home for only the second time in the week since Ray had died, her phone rang again. She considered not answering it, but could not resist doing so, a sense of both longing and hopelessness in her chest.
Ray?
She said.
Why did the man always get hit by a bike on his way to work?
Ray said, and Teresa burst into tears. For the next several days, Teresa lived in a fog. She always took Ray's call. Some days she let the conversation play out like it had on the first day, relishing in those first fleeting seconds when Ray was still happy and alive. Other days she interrupted his joke in order to ask him a question, like where he had put the key to the safety deposit box or where he had filed insurance papers. Confused but cooperative, Ray always answered her questions. Some days she used those initial seconds to convey her deep love for him, and she sobbed as he had expressed his love for her in return. But then, all too quickly, the sound of a gun would bring their conversation to an abrupt end. And then, one day, weeks on, the phone had rung and Teresa had said,
"Hello, baby,"
and waited for Ray to launch into his bicycle joke. There was a pause, and Ray had said,
Reese, did I call you earlier today?
A coldness spread through Teresa's chest that she couldn't understand.
What? No, you didn't.
That's so strange.
Ray said.
I picked up the phone to call you and got this sudden sense of deja vu, like I already called you today.
A tear fell silently down Teresa's cheek. She couldn't find words.
Is everything okay?
Ray asked.
I miss you, baby.
Ray chuckled.
I miss you too.
He responded, more of a question than a statement.
I'll see you in a few hours.
No, you won't.
She said.
Reese, what?
And then he stopped.
Did you hear that?
Teresa hung up the phone. Her thoughts stirred with confusion and an odd sense of hope. Every prior conversation had been laden with a heavy sense of the inevitable. No matter what Teresa said to him, Ray would always end up dead on the floor of his office bathroom. But today he had seemed to remember something. And their conversation had taken a different course at Ray's direction. And Teresa began to wonder what would happen if she tried pushing harder, made more of an effort to get Ray to take a different course of action. The next day when Ray called, Teresa immediately took charge of the conversation.
Ray, I need you to listen to me carefully and answer me as fast as you can. How many different ways are there out of your office? Out of your department, I mean.
What?
Answer me!
There's the main door, straight through goes to the IT department, and to the left takes me down to the main hallway. There's a second door that goes through HR, but it just meets up at the main hallway at the other end. And there's the door to the balcony. Why are you asking me this?
Grab your keys. Don't grab anything else. Go through the IT department. Do not go down the hall. Get to your car and come home now.
There was a pause, and then Ray said,
Okay, I'm coming.
And the line went dead. Teresa found herself out of breath while she waited. She paced. Moments later, her phone rang again.
Reese, listen to me. There's a man with a gun.
Teresa screamed in frustration and threw her phone across the room, where it hit the carpet and slid across the floor. The next time he called, Teresa asked,
Ray, the balcony outside your department, does it have steps that go down to the courtyard?
Yeah? Why do you ask?
And you can get to the parking lot from there.
Yes? What's going on?
Go. Don't ask me anything. Just go out the balcony doors and to your car. Do it now. Come home.
Teresa insisted.
Is everything okay?
Go!
A minute passed, then two. Teresa barely breathed as she stared at her phone. 5 minutes passed without a call from Ray. She was finally able to take a breath. Teresa was on her bed. Her back ached as she sat arched over her phone. For the first time since the day he died, there was no second phone call, and Teresa had no idea what to expect next. She was lost in a nearly thoughtless daze when she heard the front door open. She jumped and nearly cried out. The door closed and she heard footsteps. She jumped from the bed, racing from the bedroom and down the hallway to the foyer. And impossibly, there he was. His tall, gangly, goofy-looking yet handsome self, although his skin was deathly pale to the point of almost being blue. He smiled at her, although his brow was furrowed in concern. His mouth formed the beginnings of a question, but she ran to him and leapt into his arms. He was cold, deathly cold, and Teresa gasped. "Is everything okay?" he asked. His voice sounded like it did on mornings when he had first woken up, rattling and unused.
Everything is okay now,
Teresa said, weeping into his shoulder, holding him tighter than she ever had before. And in return, Ray held her tightly as well, but his hands were like ice on her back, his body stiff against hers, and although her ear was pressed firmly against his chest, she could not feel his heart beating, a fact that she dismissed just as quickly as she realized it. Teresa decided to tell him everything. Sitting at the kitchen table, she held his icy hand in both of hers as she recounted everything from the initial shooting at Ray's office, his death, his funeral, and his daily phone calls. He stared at her blankly, his face registering no alarm, confusion, or even recollection as she spoke. She sat back in her chair and considered him for a moment.
Tabula rasa.
She thought dully as she looked at him. He wasn't hungry, he wasn't thirsty. He was content to sit quietly until Teresa gave him directions to move. Her heart ached with the dueling emotions of relief and terrible confusion, and she watched him closely, unable to hide the obvious bewilderment on her face. And yet, Ray never asked her what was wrong. That evening, Teresa led Ray to their bedroom, where he stood dully by the foot of the bed and looked at her as if he had never been in the room before. She undressed him, and as she did so, she realized he was wearing his work clothes, not the suit he had been buried in, the suit he had worn on their wedding day. She pulled back the covers and told him to lie down. He did so with silent obedience. She slid in beside him and kissed him. His kiss was both familiar and foreign to her. His lips were soft and passive where they had always been firm and insistent before, and there was no warmth there. But the texture and the taste of him was the same. They made love, Teresa initiating and leading where Ray had always taken charge before, and while her heart overflowed with the joy of being held by her husband once more, Her body shivered at the iciness of his touch. When Teresa woke the next morning, sunlight touching her eyelids, she reached out without opening her eyes, but her fingers encountered nothing. Ray's side of the bed was empty, the covers pulled up as if he had never been there. She sat up abruptly.
Ray?
There was no answer. She searched the house, calling out for him several times, but he was gone. She returned to the bedroom, feeling both confused and sorrowful. Where had he gone, and would he not come back? And then, shortly after noon, her phone rang. The screen said Ray. She answered it.
Ray?
Reese.
He said, his voice sounding even more raspy and unused than before.
Don't worry. I know there's a shooter. I'm coming home.
The line went dead, and Teresa set her phone down. Her chest nodded in a cacophony of emotions, sorrow, hope, frustration, and even fear, that she realized she could hardly feel anything anymore. But come home he did, and this became their new pattern, the new vicious cycle they were stuck in. Every day he would come home, every day looking even more pale and feeling even more cold to the touch, his personality receding even further into the empty shell that he was becoming, a vacancy behind the eyes that had once been so passionate and full of life. Teresa had to tell him to sit, to eat, to bathe himself. He was like an elderly man who was losing use of his faculties, and Teresa evolved into his loving but confused and somewhat terrified caretaker. And every morning, Ray's side of the bed would be empty again, and he would call Teresa from work shortly after noon to tell her that he was coming home. Teresa noticed that each time, his voice sounded more like it was being dragged over stones.
Like his vocal cords are decaying.
She thought. It was not long before his countenance began to catch up with his voice. He began to look more physically withered, his tall frame beginning to bend, his eyes large in their sockets as his face became even more wan and his cheeks more sunken. Teresa allowed this cycle to continue for months, her love for her husband locking her in a living hell, but she was rapidly reaching the point of collapse herself, her emotional and mental well-being withering right along with Ray's countenance.
I'm coming home,
he had said to her over the phone, his voice like dusty rocks being rubbed together, barely recognizable to her.
Wait.
She had said.
Ray, don't. Don't come home. Stay there. It's okay. Stay there.
No.
He responded, slowly and without emotion.
No, if I stay here, I'll die. I'm coming home.
Teresa had hung up the phone, wept, and waited once more for her husband to return. She wept because her husband was dead. She wept because he was alive and yet dying more every day before her very eyes. She wept because she felt bound to him in whatever repeating loop that his death and their love had created. And she wept because they were together again, and yet she felt entirely alone. Finally, on the day that Teresa took her own life, she made a decision that came to her easily and without fear. In fact, the idea gave her the first comfort she had felt in the years since Ray had died. Perhaps the key to escaping this living hell was to die herself. More precisely, to die beside Ray as they slept together in bed, and in the morning, when he was gone, perhaps she could be gone too. Gone, but together. She called me that afternoon to tell me her story, to tell me her plan, and to tell me goodbye. I listened with terrified disbelief as she recounted the details of her miserable life in the months since Ray had died. Her story was one I could not accept as fact, and yet simultaneously I knew from the sound of her tired yet determined voice that my daughter was telling me the absolute truth. "Is Ray there now?" I asked her.
Yes.
She said tiredly.
Do you want to talk to him?
I didn't answer. But then I heard Teresa say distantly,
It's Dad. Talk to him.
There was a shuffling sound, followed by a raspy breath. Ray? I said, and I was surprised to find my own voice was trembling. He didn't respond, but I could hear as he attempted to. All I heard was the sound of his laborious breath and the vaguely recognizable tones of his voice as he attempted to speak, but his words were garbled, his voice wasted. Teresa took the phone back.
I have to go now, Daddy.
"Baby, don't do this," I said, crying but trying to hold myself together. I love you. Your mother loves you. Let us help you. There has to be some other way." Teresa began to cry.
There is no other way, Daddy. This is the only way.
"No," I insisted. "You still have so much to live for. Let me take you away from there. You can come here. Maybe Ray won't come to you anymore if you're not there." I felt myself playing along with her, even though I wasn't sure I even fully believed her.
Daddy, there's something else.
She said, taking a long and exhausted breath.
I'm pregnant.
I started, then stopped. A hard lump rose in my throat. I couldn't breathe. My mind pieced it together. Teresa was pregnant, and Ray had been dead for more than a year.
It's Ray's.
She said, answering the question I hadn't asked.
But I don't know what it is. I just know I can't, Daddy. I just can't.
She wept. She said her final goodbyes to me, ignoring my pleading, and then the call was over. I already told you how the police found her. The autopsy revealed that she had died consuming a large number of sleeping pills left helpfully behind by her best friend Cheryl. The autopsy also revealed that she had been several months pregnant. I insisted that this detail never be revealed to her mother. Estranged and distant though we are, there are some horrors a mother should be spared when it comes to her own child. So this, as I said, is Teresa's story, and the story of her husband Ray. And you may not believe me, but it's an absolutely true story. As fantastical as that might sound, I believe Teresa now. Although 2 weeks ago, when she told me her story for the first time, of course I had doubted her. I doubt her no more, not a single detail, because every day she calls to tell me all over again. Proxima Centauri is a low-mass star that is part of the southern Centaurus constellation. The star is 4.24 light-years away from Earth. If you had a powerful enough laser, it would take the beam of light 4.24 years to get to the star. When you look up at the star, you are actually perceiving it as it was 4 years ago. The current fastest-moving object, made by man, is the original Voyager probe. It is traveling over 35,000 miles per hour, and even at such an extreme velocity, it would take thousands of years to reach the star. The only practical way to get there is via faster-than-light travel, or FTL for short. According to Einstein, a fundamental rule of the universe is nothing but light itself can go that fast. The year was 2037, and that was the year we broke that rule. But at what cost? My name is James Anderson. I've been in the Air Force for 15 years, and it's always been said I was the best man they ever had. 2 years ago, I got an invitation from NASA to take part in a groundbreaking project. NASA was always a dream of mine. As a boy, I had always dressed up as an astronaut for Halloween and read basically all of the books on them and the history of spaceflight. Joining the Air Force was the next best thing, and I ended up enjoying it a lot. I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot for experimental fighters. The director of the project went by the name Dr. Robert Butler. Robert was a tall, ginger man with a brain that would make even Einstein envious. Robert was the person who personally invited me to partake in his project. I accepted almost instantly when he called, and we set up a meeting to discuss details. The meeting place was a nondescript office building in the middle of Bethesda, Maryland. Robert's office was probably the cleanest room I'd ever been in. He had a huge mahogany desk with a computer monitor that spanned almost half the desk on the corner. Behind him was a bookshelf full of books and miniature model aircraft. A pleasant autumn aroma filled the air from the incense he had burning on the other side of the room. Robert sat me down with a handshake and started. "Hello, James. Thank you for meeting with me today." Thank you for having me. I'm excited to explore the opportunities in front of me," I responded eagerly. "Let's get the formalities out of the way so we can get down to business. I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, as this project is classified, top secret." Robert slid me a thick document. As I suspected, it was the aforementioned agreement. I had signed thousands of these in the past, so I knew the drill. It basically said that if you discussed the project with anyone outside its scope, it was considered treason. I promptly signed the document with the expensive fountain pen he had on his desk, half expecting him to leap out of his seat, telling me it was a display piece only. He didn't. Passing the documents back to him and returning the pen, I thanked him and asked, "So, what is this groundbreaking project you speak about?" "Are you familiar with the theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre?" Robert asked with a curious expression. "I have read about him. He theorized a way to travel faster than light, but that theory was disproved a long time ago," I retorted. Robert sat back in his chair and went on. "What if I told you we recently revised his work and put it into practice?" Another question popped into my mind. "Miguel's FTL engine required significant power to function. Nothing in the world can create that much energy." "Yes, James, legitimate question. The scientists at the CERN Large Hadron Collider have been able to find a way to produce large amounts of antimatter. We have produced enough for a trip to Proxima Centauri and back with a little extra," he answered. "So you've built a ship?" I asked. "Yes, we're calling it the Trieste, after the submersible piloted by Jacques Piccard that dove into the deepest depths of the ocean. It seemed the most appropriate," Robert replied. I was humbled to be a part of something so much bigger than myself. I would have a chance to shape the future of mankind and affect many generations ahead of me. My heart started beating rapidly as I inquired, "How fast does it go?" "According to our calculations, the Trieste has a max velocity of 32.47 times the speed of light, and you're going to be her pilot," he answered, as if waiting for this question the whole time. Before I could ask the date of the flight, he handed me a contract that outlined the whole project. Upon signing the contract, Robert set me up with living accommodations and held out his hand. I shook it and left to move into the apartment he provided for me. After I settled in for a week, Robert invited me back to a spacious conference room to meet the others who would join me on the pioneering flight. Robert called 4 people into a line, each at the top of their respective fields and eager to change history. The first I was introduced to was engineer Dr. Pravina Cook. Pravina designed and helped construct the reactor and FTL drive. She was a shorter woman, maybe just over 5 feet, with long dark hair, in her 30s. What she lacked in height, she makes up for in intelligence. The next person I was introduced to was Dr. Haruto Moon. Dr. Moon was a medical doctor. He was tall, with short hair and a suit. Haruto was recently in the running to become Surgeon General, so NASA jumped at the opportunity to invite him. Then I met the chief scientist, Dr. Elizabeth Murphy. Elizabeth was one of the most beautiful women I have ever set my eyes upon. Her eyes were like diamonds. My gaze was transfixed on her smiling face before the man next to her cleared his throat. I snapped out of it and shook her hand, and his. The man was the commanding officer of the Trieste, Colonel Edward Thomas. Thomas didn't look anything like the colonels I've worked with over the years. He was short and thin, so not very intimidating. I showed him proper respect nonetheless. Before our handshake was finished, he leaned down to my ear and whispered, "I saw how you looked at Elizabeth. That's not what this mission is about. So if you would kindly keep your dick in your pants, this will all go over smoothly." I nodded before joining him in the line. Robert handed us each a glass of champagne and gave a toast. "To new horizons." We all clinked our glasses and socialized. The next day was orientation. We all met in the same conference room. It was that day I finally got to see the Trieste. Although it was only a render on the wall, it looked like I was looking at the real thing. At the front of the craft was a large spherical command structure, probably where we controlled everything. Behind the sphere was what looked like a communications array. Then there was the reactor, sandwiched between two vast rings. The rings were the main component of the FTL drive. Behind that, at the direct aft of the ship, were the main engines for standard propulsion. Flanking the reactor were two cylindrical tanks for the fuel. One had antimatter, and the other tank contained matter. Those two substances emit vast amounts of energy when combined. The reactor controlled that and converted it to energy. Robert began by explaining why he chose Proxima Centauri. As you may already know, Proxima Centauri is the closest star to Earth other than the Sun. This makes it an excellent candidate for this project. That's not the only reason we chose it, though. For a little over 40 years, that star has been emitting bursts of ultra-high energy radio waves. When analyzed, the signal is random in nature, basically bursts of static. Don't stars emit all kinds of waves? I questioned. Yes, James, you are correct. The remarkable thing about these ones is they happen every hour on the dot. If that wasn't strange enough, every burst is completely identical. The room fell silent as everyone was in a state of shock. Robert chuckled. That was my exact reaction. Your task is to travel to the star and use the equipment you bring along to study it and find out what causes the signals. I smiled when I saw the joy on Elizabeth's face. Stars were her area of study. Robert began answering more questions we had. Some important particulars stood out to me. The Trieste is still under construction in orbit. It will take 1.5 months to reach the star at max speed, and we are scheduled to depart in 1 year after vigorous training. Our orientation ended, and we went home. NASA put my body to its extreme upper limit over that year. I had never been tested like that, not even during my time in the Air Force. In one of the simulations, they put me in a chair attached to a spinner that spun incredibly fast to simulate G-forces. Another time, I was put in a chamber for several hours under high atmospheric pressure to see how I responded to change. After many tests like this, my shipmates and I were ready to go. Launch day had arrived. This was a top-secret mission, so the trip to the Soyuz rocket that would take us up was oddly void of reporters. I didn't have anyone to say bye to, which was one of the reasons I was selected, as there was every chance the ship could just explode. The Soyuz rumbled to life as it violently carried us up. I had never been so uncomfortable in such a comfortable seat. Eventually, the rumbling stopped, and I felt weightless. Moments later, Elizabeth screamed.
Look!
I looked out the window. Before me was the Trieste in all her magnificence. It was surrounded by the scaffolding used to help in the construction. The capsule docked with the ship, and we boarded. Before me was the command center and the finest technology that humanity had to offer. At the front was a single grand console, my console, used for navigation. The ship, oddly, had gravity, although I didn't know how it worked. I hiked across the spacious room to my console so I could examine it. To my left was a small joystick like you'd find on an arcade cabinet. It was used to control the thrusters that steered the ship. There was a camera system there so I could see where we were going. Directly in front of me was an extensive celestial map so I could see where we were and plot courses. Overlaying the map were the controls for the FTL drive, which were simple. Pravina handled the complicated aspects naturally. Finally, to my right was a simple throttle for the main engines and a multifunction display for factors like power levels and velocity. Colonel Thomas said, "All right, everyone, to your stations." Pravina and Elizabeth took their stations on either side of me. Elizabeth's station allowed full access to the sensors and scanners installed on the ship, which she used to study Proxima Centauri. We spent a couple of hours preparing as the scaffolding around the ship was taken away. Robert called over the radio. "All right, everything looks good from our end. Proceed whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Robert. We will contact you when we are in position to go light speed," replied the colonel. "James, take us out." I tapped on my console, firing up the engines, and the ship gained speed. We could not perceive it, though, due to the artificial gravity. The ship needed to be far away from Earth in case of a disaster. On one camera, it gave me a view behind the ship, and the Earth was visibly getting smaller. Eventually, we got out of range. I cut the engines and let the Trieste coast. "We're in position, sir," I informed Thomas. He relayed the information to control. This is it, people. Charge the rings, James, he instructed. I started the charge sequence, and the ship began to hum as the rings roared to life. Looking at the readout, I read 2 minutes to charge. 2 minutes to charge! There was an atmosphere of anxiety and excitement. My panels turned green as the coils finished charging. The colonel knew this and had a seat. After the click from his harness, he addressed the crew. Whatever happens, you have all done this country proud. James, engage. I had the biggest smile on my face as I nodded and did as instructed. We heard a loud burst of energy. Colors dazzled our eyes as we gazed out the front window. What followed was unnerving silence. I came to my senses and studied the panel in front of me. Holding steady at 24.5 C. We're stable, I exclaimed. A wave of relief washed over all of us before we started celebrating. What I saw out of the window is hard to explain. It was like we were flying through a blue tunnel of light. Pravina promptly checked the drive for any issues. She found none. We all congregated in the mess area for a meal while Dr. Moon examined himself and the rest of us for any negative effects of our transition to light speed. To his amazement, we all looked perfectly healthy. Dinner was disgusting freeze-dried chicken, or what looked like chicken and tasted like rubber. Despite the horrible cuisine, we were all happy as could be. To us at the time, we just made history. It was the life goal of every human being. We were proud. Soon, it was time to sleep for the long trip. The pods were programmed to wake us up 5 hours before we reached Proxima Centauri. Pravina checked over the systems methodically before getting into her pod. She didn't want there to be any problems while we were sound asleep. As my pod closed, I felt claustrophobic before gently drifting into a deep slumber. I awoke seemingly minutes later to a blinding light. Dr. Moon and Elizabeth, with those beautiful eyes, were standing above me. She smiled, saying,
We're here, James.
I slowly sat up and got out of my pod. The 2 other crewmates were awake as well. Dr. Moon gave me a pill to help me recover from the extended rest, and I got out of my pod. Thomas asked me where we were. The trudge to my console was a little awkward as it felt like I was learning to walk for the first time again. The console read an ETA of 4 hours, 13 minutes, and 53 seconds. I turned to Dr. Moon. I thought we were supposed to wake at 5 hours, not 4 1/4. You're right. We had a little trouble with your pod. It wouldn't open, he replied with a concerned expression. The crew and I spent the remaining 4 hours checking systems and getting food in our bodies. It was fish this time, equally rubbery as the chicken. Eventually, it came time to shut off the engines as we had arrived. There was a blinding light out the window. I was looking at another star. It just sunk in, the gravity of what we had just accomplished. I don't think I was the only one with that feeling. Thomas yelled an instruction. Bring us into orbit of the star, James. With a permanent smile on my face, I acknowledged and used my console to fire up the engines and put us into orbit. Are we able to filter out all the blinding light? Thomas asked. Elizabeth spoke up.
The window has one. I'll activate it.
My heart hit the deck with an audible thud when she activated the filter. I observed the star being covered in green, vine-like structures. It almost seemed organic. Proxima Centauri looked alive. It was visibly throbbing. I was terrified at the sight. What the hell? That's not what a star is supposed to look like, Thomas said, shocked. Elizabeth tapped her panel with determination. She concluded with the spectrographic analysis that the star was indeed organic. There was nothing in her analysis that pointed to it being a star of any classification other than the blinding light that it emitted. How could we not have seen this with our instruments from Earth? I concluded it was somehow able to trick them from the vast distance. Elizabeth noted with a puzzled expression.
I don't understand how this is possible.
How long until the next radio burst?
5 minutes.
She replied as she checked her panel. As we waited, I was a nervous wreck. 5 minutes came, and the radio pulse did as well. I felt a slight tingling sensation, but it was harmless. We were monitoring the signal, and it was the same as previously recorded pulses, according to Elizabeth. What do you make of all this, Dr. Moon? The colonel asked, without diverting his gaze. Moon didn't respond. I could hear soft, high-pitched wheezing coming from his direction. The colonel noticed too and turned around. Dr. Moon was completely motionless. Assuming he was just daydreaming, Thompson said, "Dr. Moon!" What happened next was the most disturbing, frightening thing I've ever witnessed. That was saying something coming from a soldier like myself. Moon started convulsing violently before slowly changing into something. His arms, his legs, his fingers, his toes and neck all grew to double their length. Sharp teeth descended from his gums, and existing teeth broke into sharp points. His jaw disconnected from his skull, giving him a gaping, terrifying maw. One of the panels behind him gave a reflected view of his back. His back split apart, exposing his spine, with each vertebrae having long, jagged spikes protruding from them. The same sort of spikes were also protruding from all the joints of his body. His skin turned a dark green color and was ripping apart, exposing bone and a powerful muscular structure. There was nothing recognizable left. I sprinted at Elizabeth and grabbed her arm as we raced to safety. Pravina followed, but Colonel Thomas, rest his soul, wasn't so lucky. Moon, or what we thought was Moon, lunged at him with a high-pitched, unnatural screech, thrusting both arms into the colonel's chest, aided by the spikes that grew on his knuckles. Thomas didn't make a sound, just went limp, with his arms dangling below him. His motionless body was lifted off the ground. I winced with horror. There was an explosion of blood and gore as the creature separated its arms, ripping the already deceased Colonel Thomas in half. His blood-soaked insides were scattered all over the room. In all my years of military service, I'd never seen anything even remotely more disturbing. With no time to mourn our fallen comrade, we moved into the mess hall and closed the door, locking it. The two girls were sobbing. None of us wanted to talk about what just happened or what caused it. Pravina noted, still sobbing,
"We need to kill it."
Nobody ever thought to pack weapons on this ship, as it was a mission of exploration, and this occurrence would never show up in any manual. The three of us collected ourselves, and I cracked open the door. Moon was pacing around the room and noticed me. He produced another loud screech and charged at me. I got back inside just in time, and he started banging on the door relentlessly. Try and find something I can use as a weapon," I said frantically.
"We may not need one. The main airlock is the room with it. There's a console in the communications room opposite this door that can open it."
Pravina said, still shaking with fear. I opened the door, and the creature was in the middle of the room, standing above the colonel as if it was admiring its kill. I threw a piece of metal past it, and the creature jumped at where it hit the ground. I gathered up all of the strength and determination I could muster and bolted for the communications room. The creature saw me and got within inches, but I made it and sealed the door behind me. Moon, as if he knew what was about to happen, pounded much louder than before, almost desperate. I used the auxiliary console to increase the pressure and blow out the airlock. The environment outside the door sounded like a wind tunnel. The pounding ceased. I could hear it frantically claw at the ground before it flew out helplessly. I resealed the airlock and pressurized it. Upon opening the door, both the creature and the colonel were gone, with deep claw marks in the ground and around the airlock. To my horror, I looked up and it had completely trashed the command deck. All the consoles were destroyed with no way to use them. We were dead in the water with no way to control the ship. They both took on my shocked face when presented with the carnage. "Can we activate the drive from the reactor room?" I asked Pravina.
"Yes, but we would have no navigational control,"
she replied skeptically. With haste, we made our way to the reactor control room. The room was dissimilar from the rest of the ship. It had an industrial design. Pravina did her magic to try and charge the rings before another burst. There was no way to know which one of us would change into that thing. Her fingers tapped away at an inhuman pace. She froze.
"No!
What? Elizabeth and I responded in unison.
"The rings aren't charging. The creature must have hit one when he flew out of the airlock,"
she said with a defeated look on her face. I felt as if the entire universe was trying to kill us. The three of us went to a window. We were shocked to discover that there was a deep gash on the side of one of the rings. That meant the only chance we had was the main engines. We could get far enough away and try to fix the rings with a spacewalk, We had no way of knowing how far away the pulse had an effect and wasted no time starting them up from the reactor room. Pravina put all available power through the engines, including the power from life support. 30 minutes later, we were going fast enough that I could perceive the organic star drifting away slowly. There was 15 minutes until the next burst. The three of us took shelter with nothing left to do and separated ourselves with doors between us, just in case we were not far away from the star. The engines were still going. We were keeping in constant contact using the intercom system. Elizabeth monitored for the burst. The three of us had never been so scared in our lives, as we now knew what was potentially about to happen. Our fate was inevitable. The burst came and went. The two started sobbing again. As far as I could tell at the moment, we were all safe. I broke down with relief, as it was one issue we no longer had to deal with. One of them stopped crying. "Elizabeth?" I called out.
I'm here, James! I'm here!
Elizabeth cried. That same screech came out of the speakers. It was so loud, my eardrums were in searing pain. I called for Pravina. It was already too late for her. She was in the pod room. Elizabeth was the only thing on my mind at that time. I had a clear path to get to her. She was in the communications room. I went over and joined her there. We had an hour left. The two of us knew there was no chance of repairing the ring without Pravina. Pravina started pounding on her door as the transformation was complete. I'm recording this from that room with Elizabeth. I don't know if my story will reach Earth. Even if it did, it would be too late for us, as it takes a whole 4 years with light-speed communications. We are just too far away. Pravina just busted out of the pod room. She knows where we are and has been trying to get to us. I don't know how long we have left. I don't know what will get us first, Pravina or the next burst. All I know is I don't want to die in either fashion. I'm contemplating evacuating the air from this room. Elizabeth agreed and started sobbing uncontrollably. The air is getting thin. Humans can survive about 6 minutes without oxygen. It is an agonizing death, but it is far better than the alternative. I do not regret going on this mission. Neither does Elizabeth. We are fortunate to make our world proud. If you are hearing this message, please stay away from Proxima Centauri. It is not what it seems. The room is now completely void of oxygen. Elizabeth has gone unconscious. I'm devastated, but I know I won't be that way for much longer. Only one thing left to do. Send. I'm not the type of doctor that usually gets emergency calls from patients, so I was definitely confused when my latest contacted me in the middle of the night and begged to see me right away. He seemed sincere enough that I told him I'd meet him at my office. That groggy and half-awake choice is the only reason my family is still alive. While I was putting on my clothes and trudging out to the car, I tried to remember everything I could about Anton. When he'd first come to us, he'd been deaf for 8 years due to an auto accident, so he was perfect for the trials. Of the 20 patients who'd undergone ear and nerve regeneration therapy, he'd been the first to begin hearing again. He'd been so happy the last few weeks. I had no idea what could have gone wrong. I was so preoccupied that I didn't even notice the streetlights were out. When I arrived at my office, he was already standing at the far corner of the parking lot, nervously scanning the area. Cast in white by my headlights, he frantically waved his arms horizontally to get me to turn my car off, and then wordlessly insisted I hurry and unlock the front door of the building. I was concerned, but had never known him to be violent or on drugs, so I got out my keys, held myself a bit guarded away from him, and opened the door. He slipped past me on the left as I entered, nearly knocking me aside before he took up position behind the floor-to-ceiling glass wall and continued peering out into the night. His behavior more than warranted comment. "Anton, are you in danger? We should call the police. he began to exclaim, "No!" but cut himself off harshly after the initial "nuh" sound and went bug-eyed. After another hurried scan out the window, he turned to me and whispered, "No police. They can't help." Attempting to control his anxiety and help him focus, I held out an arm and led him into my office. Sitting down in a familiar setting by yellow lamplight appeared to help him, but he shook his head when I went to turn on the bright white overheads. Acquiescing, I sat behind my desk and let him explain himself. "Doctor," he said with emphasis, as my title was the whole reason he was coming to me, "I've been hearing things." Despite my best effort, I let slip a micro-expression of confusion. Anton widened his eyes and hurriedly elaborated. "I know that's the whole point of the treatment, and I've been very happy with my progress so far. You guys have been great, the whole team. It's just that there's something more going on. Last week, I began to hear this absurd, crazy choir of whistling like constant wind chimes during the day. That was not a good sign. A flaw in the nerve regeneration process could create problems for our funding and for other patients. Perhaps some form of tinnitus." No, he countered. "They were real sounds. It was super annoying, and I spent all Saturday afternoon tracking it down until I finally found it. A bunch of people were blowing whistles at the dog park." I frowned. "Some sort of protest?" "No, dog whistles. I could hear dog whistles." At that, I sat up a little taller in my seat. An unexpected discovery in the process could create quite the opposite of problems for our funding. "You could hear dog whistles? You're certain?" He nodded, clearly relieved that I was believing him so far. "We can run tests to confirm, but that's fantastic. Not only has your normal hearing been restored, but your range of frequencies." "Yes," he said in a sudden emphatic whisper. "Hearing the dog bark is one thing, but it didn't stop there. All week it got worse." Damn. I got out a pad of paper and pen to take notes. "Go on." Encouraged by that, he leaned forward in his chair and gripped the edge of my desk. "I first began to hear them on Monday. The Monday a few nights ago. Yes, I didn't know what it was, but I chalked it up to my better hearing and tried to ignore it that first night. The longer I lay there in bed, the more the sounds began to come into focus. It was like this muffled wiggling sound coming from outside, but when I opened the window, I couldn't be sure if it was louder. I wrote it down, but remained uncertain. It continued to get worse after that?" He ran a hand back along his unkempt hair and sighed with relief at finally having his anxieties heard. "Yeah. Never during the day. Never when there's music playing or people around or the television left on. It's always at night when I'm alone. A feeling comes over me, like my body telling me I'm in danger for some reason, and then I begin to hear it. It's a rapid, back and forth swishing sound, but dampened somehow. It's like it's coming from far away, or at least it's far away until I make a noise." "Until you make a noise? You think these sounds are responding to you somehow?" "I know they are," he insisted quietly. "They're swimming around out there looking for prey, like any living thing would be. See, that's what I figured out tonight, and that's why I called you. After spending every night all week listening to it, I finally got it. I'm hearing swimming sounds. They're all different, too. A pulsing octopus, some fish, maybe shark, or other ocean things that I can hear when I finally sleep. When I dream, things get all screwed up and horrifying with screams and calls that would make you shiver for the rest of your life. I looked up a bunch on Wikipedia, but the sight of them..." He trailed off into visible rising anxiety. I stopped writing and held up a hand. "Whoa, Aton. Let's just walk it back a step. If you think you're hearing swimming sea life, where's the ocean?" He slowly raised his head to look me straight in the eyes. Behind his irises, a dark glare of sprouting madness burned. "All around us, Doc." I began to reach for my phone, but he drew a long knife from under his shirt and held it forward. Breathing hard, he shouted, "Don't do it! You hear me out! I'm not crazy! I tried to tell my friends. I tried to tell my folks. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. Just listen to me." This was the first time a patient of mine had ever gotten violent, but I knew the procedures. Okay, Anton, I'll listen. You just bring the stress level in here down a little and lower the knife. I'm not gonna drop it, he told me, his gaze sharp. Just listen to me. Okay. He waited. I looked down at his knife and up at his face twice. Your pen and paper? He said. Right. I lifted them carefully, eyeing him for signs of quick movement. Here's my reasoning, Doctor. He finally continued, returning to calmer and more formal speech. I hear things swimming by all the time. I try to stay where it's loud. The noise wards them off, like animals avoiding a boat. I went to a concert. I left the TV on. You know that feeling that you get when you're all alone and you just want to run? Like something's chasing you out of the dark and you just need background noise to feel safer? I gulped down an unhappy knot. Yeah? It's them, he whispered. They're out there, but you see, I've got a problem now. That lamp on your desk? It's got batteries, right? The small yellow lamp had been a gift. Yes. The rest of the world doesn't have batteries. The power's out in Los Angeles, New York, and here. They're coming for us. The power was out? I hadn't even noticed because he'd shaken his head when I tried to turn on the overheads. There's no music, he said with rising fear. There's no television to leave on. They're swimming freely all over the city. They're closer than ever, and I have no way to avoid them. He turned his head as if listening to some nearby noise. None of us do. They'll hear us. Something occurred to me that I figured might just save my life. Wait, so you hear wiggling sounds when you're alone and it's quiet? Yeah? He seemed momentarily hopeful at my question. It's your ears. I laughed. It all made sense. If your hearing's gotten that good, then when there's no other sources of sound, you're hearing the microscopic life in your ear canal. He froze as his anxiety found an avenue for explosive decompression. Oh. He stared at me for a moment. Like super tiny things? Yeah, I said, smiling at him as he lowered the knife. Anton, you're gonna be fine. We'll figure out a way to dull your hearing a little so you don't have to hear them. Everyone's got tiny little bugs on them, visible only with microscopes. They can't hurt you. But his anxiety didn't fall away completely. I don't know. It sure sounds like I'm underwater and things are swimming all around me. He lifted the knife again. Where would there be an ocean? I asked him. We're in San Francisco. We're not deep underwater, in some ocean filled with nightmare things. Come on, shout. Go on, take a yell. Kick the false terror to the curb. I want to, I just... Do it. Be the good man I know you are. Unsure of what to do, he half smiled, half frowned, then gave a weak yell of defiance. Good, I told him. Again, come on, yell. Damn things, he said louder. I needed him to see that we were safe. Yell, Anton. Damn things, you aren't real, he shouted at the top of his lungs. I'm not afraid of... The next part has taken me a couple days to piece together by memory. There was an explosion of some sort, but lacking fire. The floor and the ceiling seemed to implode into each other, sending wood, brick, and glass shrapnel in every direction. My desk took much of the blast, but obviously since I'm still in the hospital, I didn't escape unscathed. Anton disappeared in an instant among the debris, but as I stumbled out of the destroyed front half of the building, I saw no blood of any kind. He'd been entirely consumed. Staggering to my car in the parking lot, I turned and had one good solid look at the aftermath. I'd been wrong. He had not been hearing microscopic life in his ear canal. I knew I was wrong because before the rest of the building collapsed from the strain, I saw the shape of the attack that had done it. It was like looking at an apple after a bite. Absolutely and undeniably the result of massive unseen jaws big enough to take out half of a 2-story building in one crunch. He was right. They are out there, and we are pursued by unseen creatures in the night. When you're alone, when it's quiet, and when you get that feeling to run and hide and stay silent, listen to it. Just listen to it. When you've been a priest for as long as I have, you start to notice patterns in people. When a parishioner approaches, I can already guess what they want to ask me by their body language or the way their eyes flicker to meet mine. It's quite funny, actually. Everyone thinks they're unique, that somehow they're different than everyone else. Well, let me tell you, after 38 years of hearing confessions, I've come to the conclusion that we're all pretty much identical. If I have to listen to one more trembling voice confess to watching pornography, I might just lose my mind. Now, I haven't turned cynical in my old age, just weary. When you hear the same sins repeated over and over again, 1,000 million times over, you begin to wonder if there's any hope left for the human race. I guess that's where faith kicks in. Though, now, I'm not sure how much of that faith I still possess. You see, I don't practice anymore. I've given up the collar. I witnessed something that has shaken me to this day, and the shadow of its memory still haunts me. It was the last confession I ever did. I stifled a yawn, trying my best to remain awake after another sobbing parishioner left the confessional. The entire process had just become so mechanical to me that I barely even heard what was being whispered on the other side of the screen. I adjusted the cushion under my rear, feeling the familiar ache that had only gotten worse as my years advanced. I checked my watch and saw that I still had another 20 minutes to go. I closed my eyes and offered it up to the Lord, begging him to fill me with patience for these people. I heard the familiar creak of wood on the other side of the screen as yet another sinner took their place. I ran a hand over my weary eyes and then spoke into the screen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I recited, making the sign of the cross. A male voice whispered to me from the other side.
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession.
I shifted the cushion beneath me, annoyed at the distraction, and tried my best to focus on the man. Do not be afraid, my son. Tell the Lord what you have done. The man said nothing for a moment, his voice rasping behind the screen.
Father, I don't think there's any hope for me. I've done so much.
I sat up a little straighter. My son, there is no sin too great for God. The man struggled to keep his emotions in check, his voice straining.
I think I've broken every rule in the book. Deception, greed, lust, murder, everything.
The mention of murder sent a cold icicle shooting up my back. You killed someone? I asked, voice hardening. This was a serious confession, one I'd never heard before in all my years in the booth. I could hear the man begin to fall apart, shame and grief washing his words in sorrow.
I've killed so many people.
My heart was racing in my chest. Who have you killed? When was this? The man sniffled.
It was a long time ago. I've been on the run for a long time. I don't know what to do anymore. My whole life has been a lie. One big fake advertisement for something I was never equipped to be.
I leaned into the screen, voice stern. Have you thought about turning yourself into the police? Coming clean will surely ease the weight of your sins. I can hear it in your voice. You're suffering. The man started crying.
You have no idea.
I knew I had to be delicate here. Son, the Lord's love is endless. He can forgive you of these transgressions if you show him how truly sorry you are. The man surprised me by barking a laugh.
His love isn't endless, nor is it unconditional.
I swallowed, treading carefully. I know it's hard to understand, to accept, especially when you're feeling so low, but hear me, nothing is too great for the Lord. His wisdom and love for you is deeper than the oceans, broader than the universe. He wants you to know that, to feel that in your soul. The man was recovering, and he snorted behind the screen.
You couldn't be more wrong.
Slightly frustrated, I pressed him. What makes you say that? Suddenly, the man's voice filled the entire booth, a deep rumble that shook me to the very core of my soul.
Because I am your Lord.
I blinked, my head spinning. This was new. Just what kind of person was I dealing with here? I suddenly realized that the mental state of this person could be seriously compromised. After a moment, I decided to play along a little longer. You're the Lord.
I can hear the doubt in your voice.
I sniffled. Well, forgive me if I am a little cautious around someone who proclaims they are the Son of God.
There is no Son of God,
The man said, irritated.
It's just me. You guys made up all that Jesus bullshit. I had nothing to do with that.
My mind was spinning as I tried to keep up. Okay, so who are you really, and what are you doing in my confessional? The man exhaled.
I just told you who I am, and I'm here to make peace before I die. Or whatever happens to me after. I don't really know how I die. I never thought about it before.
I decided it was time to start steering the ship back on course. When a soul dies in the good graces of God, it gets sent to heaven. The man laughed.
Good graces? Yeah, look, you're wrong. You're all wrong.
What are you talking about? I asked, feeling anger begin to stir in my chest. The man's voice dropped low.
Heaven is fucking gone.
I cocked an eyebrow, the seriousness in his voice giving me pause. What do you mean gone? His tone remained the same, a low rumble.
It got wiped out a long time ago. There is nothing left.
For reasons unexplainable, I began to feel uneasy, a sinking dread that was just beginning to form in my stomach. How is that possible? God is almighty, the devil can never best him, I said. The man slammed his hand against the wall, causing me to jump.
There is no devil. There never was. I don't know where you people got that, but it wasn't from me. There is just myself and heaven. No angels, no saints, nothing. I created a place for you. And I created a place for me. Then I sat around and watched my creations from the comfort of my own home. My heaven. Every once in a while, I'd poke my finger in and stir up some shit. Cause a disaster or something just to see how you'd react.
If heaven is gone, where do our souls go when we die? I asked.
I have no idea. I don't even know if you have a soul. I certainly didn't give you one. Why would I? I made you so I could have something to do. When you die, 3 more people take your place and I watch the circus go round and round. But I have to say, I'm impressed with the human race. You've all come such a long way. I never dreamed you'd create such wonders. Bravo.
The man said. Something outside the booth, in the sanctuary, crashed, but I ignored it. The man drawing all my attention. Why are you here? I repeated, mind blanking at the absurdity of what I was hearing. The man's voice turned quiet, an edge of unease now.
Because I am going to die soon. I can't hide down here much longer. They know where I am, and they're getting so close.
Who? The man collected himself before whispering.
The old horns.
I could hear the shuffling of feet echoing outside the booth as people began to leave, probably annoyed at the long confessional, but I didn't care. Something about this man held me and terrified me. I'm not following, I said, a worm of unease snaking up my stomach into my chest. I thought you said there was just you and us. I thought you said the devil didn't exist.
He doesn't. This is something else entirely.
The man hissed. The logical form of me begged to end this conversation, but I couldn't let it go. What do they want with you? The old horns. Fear entered the man's voice.
I don't know. They just showed up in heaven one day, taking me completely by surprise. They destroyed everything. Their power and wrath was more furious than anything I'd ever seen before. I had no choice. I ran.
You ran and came to Earth, I asked.
I had to. Where else is there to go? I don't know anywhere else but your world and mine. I don't have a clue where these entities came from, or how they found me, or why they want me, but There is no stopping them. They'll be here soon. I can't hide forever.
I exhaled, trying to collect my thoughts. Okay, so say hypothetically this is all true. Why would you come here? To confession. If you're God, what do you need to apologize for? The man was silent for a moment, and then said softly,
Isn't this what you're supposed to do before you die? Truth be told, I have no idea what will happen to me when they catch up. But I'm scared. I'm really, really scared. I've done a lot of bad things, and this just seemed like the right thing to do.
He trailed off miserably.
I'm not the all-loving, wonderful God humanity thinks I am. I've done things to you people that sickens me. I don't know why I did them, but I did. You can look back on history and probably pick out the events that I had a hand in. They're pretty obvious. You know how people always say, why would God let that happen? Well, it's because I'm an asshole, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the shit I've made you people go through. You didn't deserve it. I just kept pushing the envelope, and you Christians never lost faith in me. You always found ways to make sense of it all. Always giving me the glory. I didn't deserve it. Shit. I'm so sorry.
I didn't say anything. The weight of his words collapsing in on me like the walls of a cave, trapping me in their conviction. How could I believe any of this? It was nonsense, and yet... Another crash echoed in the sanctuary, and this time I took notice because it filled the silence.
Oh no.
I heard the man whisper, fear stirring his voice. What's wrong? I asked quietly. I heard the shuffle of a curtain, and then the creak of wood.
They're here.
I swallowed hard. Who?
The old horns.
Something dropped into the pit of my stomach, and I was suddenly very on edge, one hand resting on the curtain in front of me.
Don't open it. Do not look at them.
The man hissed. Why? I whispered, my voice unsteady now.
Just don't.
He said urgently.
My time here is done. I am at the end of my road. Stay in your booth, Father, until you hear the silence again. It will be safe then.
This is insane, I whispered. There's nothing out there. The man leaned into the screen, his voice earnest.
I know I have no right to ask this of you, but please, have faith in me. One last time.
My hand remained frozen, my sweaty fingers plastered to the curtain. I was paralyzed, torn between the madness of his story and the horrific sinking feeling I felt in my chest.
Please, absolve me of my sins and I'll leave you alone forever.
The man begged now, voice shaking, mind spinning. I released the curtain and turned to the screen. Something moved outside the booth, a scraping sound across the marble floors. I made the sign of the cross, voice trembling. I absolve you of your sins. Go in peace. The man exhaled heavily, relief filling him.
Thank you, Father. Thank you.
Suddenly, a noise blasted through the church, so loud I had to cover my ears, my heart leaping into my throat. It was the blast of a low horn, a long single note that rattled me to the bone. As the sound faded, a drop of sweat ran down my face.